welcome to the archive, Scott, or should I say Dr. Shell. How are you doing today?
Pretty good. Pretty good. Glad to actually start my morning with this kind of interview. So,
Awesome.
yeah.
It's good to start my morning with this kind of interview. Still haven't even finished my coffee yet. All right,
Right
so
there with you, dude.
yeah. So you are a specialist. You have a PhD in runes, particularly.
Germanic linguistics, but I focused on runology. Yeah, like my entire dissertation was on runology. Anytime that I went to an academic conference, 90% of the time it was on runic inscriptions of some sort. So, but yeah, no, technically it's Germanic linguistics with an emphasis on runology.
All right. So what got you started on that?
Um, Well, so when I was younger, we'll start there. I was actually really interested in esoteric things, like a lot of us were when we were younger, and
Yeah.
started with those things and just sort of branched out from there. So started with, anything from, even just Ralph Blum to, DJ Conway, and then I obviously started there, but then I progressed from there and just started looking into like better sources and stuff like that. But eventually I turned this into something more academic to where I wanted to focus on the academic side of things. And I started studying linguistics and then went on to Germanic linguistics. And then I'm like, oh, I can study runes on a more formal academic level. And that's actually what I stuck with. So and I had a very supportive advisor at Berkeley who thought it was interesting that I was, very much into runology, and she supported me every step of the way. She was again very supportive. She didn't actually shoot down any of my crazy ideas. Like, I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I try to be very level headed, but like, in the state of academia, if you start talking about runes and you bring up the concept of magic or myth, depending on who you're talking to, things can get a little dicey.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, I guess I'll be clear here. There's like the esoteric side of things that I study. And I try to keep that I actually do try to keep that very separate from my academic works, just because it can cause a lot of problems trying to bring esoteric ideas into objective, academic studies concerning runes and runic inscriptions.
But regardless of what people believe or don't believe, I mean, these are the beliefs of our ancestors, people that came before us, and the people who made runes.
Yeah.
And so, back to me, back then, religion for any culture, probably prior to about the 1800s, um, religion was just about everything. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we've even got, like, if you look at the blues here in America, some of these beliefs that go back thousands of years about crossroads.
Yeah,
Robert
yeah.
Johnson, his whole myth is tied into that. So I find it kind of funny that academics are like, "Oh, runes. This is nonsense we're talking about."
Well, so the thing is it's because it's become kind of quote unquote tainted with a lot of like nationalist movements and stuff like that. And so, you know, I say it that way because it's like academics don't want anything obviously to do with that, and they don't want to be associated with that, of course. And so these sort of movements are more focused on like the idea of like one people, religious aspects, mythic aspects, and not so much as focused on like, let's talk about the phonetics behind how you say this particular rune sound. They're not going to talk about that. And so with academic runology, they focus on the latter, subject of being very specific and nuanced in linguistics and stuff like that. So they don't really want to talk so much about the mythic associations, the religious connotations, just because they kind of want to stay away from at least people pointing fingers at them, and people being associated with those particular groups. That's kind of like where that's coming from. Because also you get a lot of crazy scholars out there writing all kinds of wonky stuff about runes. And, it's like when I talk about runes and magic, some academics might associate me with those people, and and they don't want to be associated with those people. And while I do study esoteric things, particularly with runes and runic inscriptions too, I'm very particular about who I'm actually studying and who I would actually refer people to and stuff like that. So, but that's basically it. It's just that they don't want to be associated with that stuff. They want to be more rooted in the hard science aspect of it, which is more like phonetics and phonology and syntax and stuff like that.
All
That's
right.
pretty much it.
So if somebody, since you know quite a few sources, what would be like a source or two for somebody to get started in that you would recommend?
On the esoteric side of things or the academic?
Well, let's do both.
Well, I'll go ahead and start with academic then. So I think Michael Barnes does a great job. You know, he's got the runes, a handbook that I can go ahead and send you a link to. I think that's a great starting point for people who just want to know more academic stuff concerning runes. I mean, there are all kinds of other sources I could recommend too, but that would be a good starting point. Esoteric, now this starts to get a little tricky. You know, I'll just be straight with you. I wouldn't recommend, you know, Ralph Bloom just because the rune names are incorrect. So, but again, you know, people might resonate with his approach, so more power to them. That's also the big difference between academia versus people who study esoteric things. It's like if you resonate with a particular approach and it works for you, who am I to say that it's wrong? You know, so
Yeah.
but yeah, I personally wouldn't start with that just because it can get confusing because of really misinformation regarding rune names. Um, for those who are interested in a sort of like more feminine side of it, a more feminine aspect of it, I would recommend, I guess, something like Freya Oswin. Um, she's interesting. She's very innovative, but people need to also understand where she came from. And she came from that sort of Llewellyn side of things, in which case was actually supported by Stephen Flowers. He actually helped her get her work published. So to that end, I also would even recommend Stephen Flowers, even though people are probably going, "Oh my God, I can't believe he just said that," because regardless, his work, particularly with like rune lore or Alu, sure, he has a lot of esoteric ideas in there, but he also has a ton of factual information in there, which is just flat out correct. So like his rune names are 100% correct, and he seems to be overlooked in the runic community as someone who he's just not even given enough credit. People sort of like brush him aside. But the thing is that if it weren't for Stephen Flowers, the English speaking people here in America wouldn't even know what runes actually are, because it was actually him who went to Germany. He studied in Germany. He studied under Klaus Duvel, for example. He's a really big runologist, and you know, he really knows his stuff, both academically and esoterically. But what I'm trying to say is that Edward or Stephen Flowers, then Edward Thorson or Stephen Flowers goes by both names. He brought that information that was all in German back here to an English speaking audience. So it was him really who really started everything with this sort of thing, at least started it with being rooted in things that were factually correct, like the rune names, you know, for example. So I would say start with them. I know not everybody's going to agree with me, but, you know, one thing's for sure. If you read his stuff and you're looking through it, even if it's just for objective academic stuff, his sources are really good. So he's hard to understand for a lot of people. I mean, I get that a lot too. But anyway, so I would say I wouldn't really recommend, I guess, the most popular rune book, Ralph Bloom, just because there's a ton of inaccurate information in there. I'd recommend Flowers. I'd recommend Freya Oswin. And Kadrick Olson is actually pretty good too. He's got runes for transformation. I like that. I respect that work. And I'll just leave it there for now. But yeah, there are a ton of sources that people could use. There's also a ton of information or misinformation out there too. It's quite a mess, really.
Yeah. All right. So what makes like you were saying about Ralph Bloom,
Mm-hmm.
his accuracy with the names.
Yeah,
Um, what makes like trying to find the name of a rune difficult? Like what makes that such a difficult process? Or
that's a good question. So, because you have rune names in Old English, for example, because we have the Old English rune poem, so we actually have the names attested there, and those names are obviously correct because they're recorded. You also have like the Old Norwegian rune rhyme, which has the rune names there too. So again, those are recorded. So what would be the problem? So if you work with an Old English system, there's not an issue because the rune names are right there. Same thing with Norwegian. Same thing could be said for Icelandic because you have the Icelandic rune poem too, and also the early modern Swedish rune poem. But the problem is that when you're talking, those are different runic systems. So you have the Old English runic system, and then that's different from the Elder Futhark. And then you have like the Younger Futhark, which is a different system from, again, the Elder Futhark. So what I'm trying to get at here is that like with Edward Thorson or Stephen Flowers, those people, those scholars created the Proto-Germanic names, and linguists create the Proto-Germanic names. And so if you see a word like Dagaz, and it's not day, I mean, it means day, but Dagaz is actually a Proto-Germanic form of that word, and it's recreated. It's reconstructed as far as like, this is what that word would have been 2000 years ago. And so linguists should be really the only people trying to reconstruct those rune names because we know what we're doing to a degree. Whereas it's like the average person, if they don't really understand linguistics, I don't really understand why they're even suggesting a rune name as far as Proto-Germanic is concerned, or as far as like the Elder Futhark is concerned. Does that kind of make sense? I mean, maybe a little
Yeah.
dense, but
Yeah, no, it is a little dense, but from my standpoint, what you're saying is linguists have studied these languages enough to really understand what they're looking at and be able to identify
well,
this.
here's an easy takeaway from this. Basically, the Elder Futhark runic names, Dagas, Orus, Thorisas, Ansus, Raido, all those names, those are all used with the Elder Futhark system. So the Proto-Germanic system, if you will, something like that.
And that
But
is
those,
the oldest, and that is the oldest system.
it is the oldest system. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, if we linguists, so for example, here we go, tying it back to your question with Ralph Bloom. So he's using the Elder Futhark system, and it's very clear if you look. Well, at least it's very clear with most of the runes there. He's using the Elder Futhark system, but the rune names should be, for example, Fehu, Orus, Thorisas, Ansus, and so on and so forth. So but they're not. So he's using the Elder Futhark runic system, but he's giving you other names there that actually aren't Elder Futhark runic names. That's why it's kind of confusing, and that's why it's just inaccurate. And that's also why I wouldn't recommend a work like that, because the person who's just going to be getting into this, they're going to see that rune name and see that rune letter association, and they're going to say, oh, this is the rune name. And it's like, no, it's not. That's something that he just made up, that he threw in there. For example, his runes are all out of order too. So,
Okay. So
you
I'm
know,
going to ask the next question with Ralph.
yeah,
Was that intentional or was that just a result of what he was researching at the time?
that's a good question. I don't think it'd be intentional. I mean, I would hope to think that there aren't, people who are doing runic studies trying to be intentionally to try to intentionally misinform people. I think it's just a result of his research because at the time, I think that book was published and it was in the early 80s. But at that time, the if you only spoke English, your resources were extremely limited. So, I would assume maybe he didn't speak German, for example, or he didn't have access to German sources. But the Germans at the time and the Scandinavians, but honestly, most of the Germans at that time, um, were the ones who were responsible for being able to do all that research. So, so in his case, he probably just didn't have access to it or didn't understand how linguistics works.
All right.
I don't think it was intentional. It also just sells really well. When you associate runes with the word guilt, for example, that's weird to me. I don't understand any rune that could be associated with that. But
It's not in the guilt is not in like any Scandinavian or Germanic language.
well, it's just like, for example, so the thing was too, real quick, is that I know I've seen the word guilt associated with the rune name, but it must have been in a different version of Bloom. So we're going to talk about a different rune name that's still problematic.
Okay.
So,
Is guilt not in Germanic or Icelandic, or at least at that
Well, funny enough, they don't really have a concept for guilt. Like,
time.
they don't have a word for guilt. That's actually a Latin borrowing.
Okay.
So, but yeah, we could talk about that more. Let's see. All right, so I'm just going to kind of back up a little bit. Okay. So for example, in Bloom, the rune names have, associated names that aren't actually historically accurate. And so for example, he even associates Loki with the word that's actually used for the word God and Ansus. So, for example, we have here, I'll go ahead and share my screen. You'll see right here that his rune says this is actually the Ansus rune, which is actually just an Aesir god. Sometimes it's also referred to specifically to Odin, but you'll see here that he associates this rune. I'll zoom in a little bit more. He associates this rune with the word God, as in the Christian God, and then the god Loki. And that just doesn't make any sense whatsoever, because historically that rune is, like I said, tied to specifically Odin. So that's just
Okay.
one example. Yeah,
So quickly, just so we understand, people who don't know anything about the Norse religion understand, especially the association with runes.
yeah,
So, we typically Westerners have this view of there's like a central god or primary
yeah,
god or the god.
yeah.
Was Odin viewed in that way, or did those god or were their gods viewed in that way, or were they viewed differently?
That's another video.
But
But
I
so
know I'm
real.
asking like multiple videos worth of questions, but just,
No, it's fine. I'll
yeah.
just be very, to the point here. I mean, if you look at Snorri, he says yes. Odin was the All Father. He was the god of them all. But if you don't look at Snorri and you look at the older sources, basically, long story short, there wasn't really any sort of like central god, like Abrahamic sort of like, Christian god of everything. Odin was specifically like for a group of people, whereas Freyr was for a group of people. And like all these people believed that all these gods, of course, existed, and they also understood the mythic paradigms, but they might have dedicated themselves more specifically to Odin for specific reasons. Like, why would you want to sacrifice to Odin for a good harvest? It doesn't quite make sense. So if you're a Viking, or if you're very much involved in runic inscriptions and dedicated to runes, for example, like, you would be more drawn to Odinic practices, as opposed to a farmer who might be more worried about his crops growing, so he's going to focus on Freyr. So
Okay.
in a very short, concise explanation, that's the best I can give you.
All right, no
So
worries. So they were
yeah.
all were they viewed equally? Like each one had a purpose in life
Um,
for the cosmos?
I yeah, I mean, you would say that they were known equally. You could say that, but again, it just depends on your class. And if you're a warrior, you're going to focus more on Thor, for example. You're going to be more associated with Thor because that's part of your primary life. Like, you're more practicing this sort of like warrior function. So while you will acknowledge these other gods, and maybe you will even sacrifice to them for whatever other purposes, you're going to mostly try to associate yourself with Thor. Right? I mean, it just makes sense. Why would a farmer want to focus on another sort of god or another sort of entity that's more rooted in war? Right? They want their crops to grow, so they're going to be associated with something else, another god. If you're on the sea, you're going to be associated more with Njordur, right? Or Ron, even. Like, you're going to make sure, for example, possibly that Ron is somehow pleased, so that way you don't lose your crew to a capsizing. So it's all going to be dynamic, I think, in that sense.
Okay.
All right. All right. So yeah. So back to the runes, but that's a good question, because again, he does tie God here. Another interesting thing is that he ties the D rune down here specifically to God's light. And that's specifically a Christian reference. I mean, you can see the capitalized G there, and it's God's light. And it's not whatsoever. Um, One more thing. He says that these are the Viking runes. They're not
Mhm.
the Viking runes, right? These are the Elder Futhark runes. The Viking runes, the so-called Viking runes, came much later. So we could sit here and talk about this work all day. Um, but those are just some things to sort of be aware of if you're going to read his work.
Yeah. Now, quickly, is probably my second to last question.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm seeing a trend. There's like a pathway of, so it started out with this Elder Futhark runes. Those are the oldest runes that we know of, and then
Yeah,
progress a little more.
yeah,
Eventually, we have the Viking runes. Eventually, you talk about Anglo-Saxon runes. You talk about the Book of English runes. Um, Now, is this all kind of like a tree, if you would? Like it just branches out, and we see that the language is evolving, or the runes are evolving, and dependent of what the culture was, what was needed at the time, what was important to those people, their
yeah.
gods.
So what you see basically is a spread of literacy. But and then that's also why people have more access to these runes. The runic inscriptions are becoming more prevalent. Like there are a ton of Anglo-Saxon runic inscriptions as opposed to like Elder Futhark runic inscriptions. There are also a ton of Viking Age inscriptions as opposed to Elder Futhark inscriptions. But it's because of the expansion of literacy. And so therefore too, when something that starts off as pretty much sacred for one group of people, when everybody starts doing it, it becomes more profane. So all of a sudden, like, I mean, it's very easy. It's a very easy concept. I mean, when you write something today, it's become so profane. You don't think about the sort of sacred nature and sort of unique nature behind how you are able to even do that, and how your brain is able to process that and put those thoughts to paper, right? Because it's everybody can do it now. It's extremely profane. But before it got to that point of being in that profane realm, it was very sacred. And again, like I had mentioned in a previous video with you and Thor, um, it used to have this sort of like teacher and learner relationship, with the rune master who would also pass down mythic lore. You don't, as it becomes more and more profane, the mythic lore and those sort of associations become slowly sort of disassociated from that system, again, to where everyone can just use it to write and create grocery lists. So, uh,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah,
And so making grocery lists.
yeah. The medieval runic inscriptions, the Bergen inscriptions, for example.
Bergen inscriptions.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Okay. So that is pretty interesting though, to see how the language evolves and
Yep.
adapts over time. Um, do you see, like, with the growth of of the languages? I think this might tie into my last or second to last question
Mm-hmm.
for you, because you were talking about making your own runes at one point on your channel, or encouraging
Oh
people
yeah,
to
yeah.
make
For
their own runes.
the people who want to practice this sort of thing. Yeah.
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 Is that something that we find in these earlier religions as well? Like it's encouraged to go ahead and create your own runes. Um,
Sort of. So sometimes, well, so here's the thing. There wasn't, at least I don't think there was any evidence to where it's like trying to think of how to phrase this. So rune masters always created their own runes. We know that with the Ek Erelaz formula. Like I, the rune master, carved this, or I, the rune master, did X, Y, and Z. But what we also see are commissioned works. So, in other words, there is a farmer, and this farmer wants his son remembered. So now we're going to move into the Viking period. And he goes and asks a particular rune master, an Erelaz or an Irelaz, spelled a couple different ways, to create the stone. And so what we see on a lot of these inscriptions, excuse me, is so and so carved the runes in memory of someone else. So it was an occupation of some sort. So it's like it wasn't like, oh, the farmer created this runestone, for his son or something like that. I think that does occur in a couple of inscriptions, but what I'm trying to say here is that more often than not, these runic inscriptions are actually commissioned by other people to sort of like commission rune masters to create these stones. So in that sense, I would say, yeah, they were. It was a different paradigm. It wasn't like the rune master was encouraging the farmer to make his own runestone, because the rune master himself, the Iralaws or the Eralaws, was already the rune master, and so he would be just commissioned to do the work.
Okay.
It would be like, to put it into a modern context, it would be like someone, if you wanted to do like divination or something like that, it would be like, instead of, it would be like somebody just going to a particular person who knows runes very well and asking them to perform a divination, because let's say they've done it for decades or something like that, or they're really good at it, something like that. Just
Okay.
commissioning work.
Yeah. So, because the rune master went ahead, was that at the time or like throughout your studies, did you see that that had like sacredness to it? Like that was
Yeah, that's why I think in the previous video I sort of said like that younger Futhark was sort of this weird transition period, because you do see the sacred nature of the runes still being used in the younger Futhark period in a lot of contexts, not all. But you have formulas, for example, that say like, may Thor bless these runes. So yeah, it's definitely used in a more sacred manner in the younger Futhark period. But then again, like I was saying too, the further you go into like the medieval period, the more the runes start becoming more of a profane nature of just like, jokes and stuff like that. Like I said, lists of things, and it's no longer about like, I mean, you do get a couple of inscriptions that are kind of like, may Thor bless these runes in the medieval period, but there's definitely more profane inscriptions in the medieval period. Yeah.
take a look at the worldview with runes. So we have our elder Futhark system with the
Mm-hmm.
younger Futhark system,
Yeah.
and then throughout that the timeline of runes, they do change,
Yeah.
and there are other cultures that it appears to have had an influence at certain times.
Yeah.
You once talked about like there was like a Latin influence suddenly on runes because
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
seems like what the Germanic tribes were influenced by based on interacting with the Romans.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, basically, I adhere more to the Latin origin theory, in which case that's where 90% of the runes come from. But you do have some runes that are not associated with particular sounds or shapes, and they look like they're innovated. And so what happened is that, as the Romans, sort of fast forwarding a little bit, when the Romans eventually brought this Roman system with them and it replaced the runes, one of your questions was about asking how it changes the worldview, and I believe it does change it drastically. So, for example, we have myths in the Greek system when we even have, well, we have myths in the Greek system as far as like how this sort of magical alphabet, or even not even magical alphabet, just the alphabet in general, was brought to the Greeks. And so it's tied into a mythic paradigm. And we also even have a Roman myth connected to the creation of the Latin alphabet, recorded by Gaius Hyginus, in which case he was around from about 64 BC to 17 CE. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because even though it was recorded there and it had a sort of mythic quality to their writing system, they became Christian. That mythic quality, then just the writing system itself, that mythic quality was no longer in that language whatsoever. It was still an ecclesiastical sort of like, Latin and everything was a very sacred language spoken in the church, for example. But as far as like them having some sort of mythic paradigm tied to the origin of this alphabet is now gone. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because that is around the time that the Romans would have brought that system to the tribes. And so with the tribes, they actually had all of these mythic associations, right? As far as like Odin bringing runes to the people, for example, Odin thinking up the runes. for example, all these different mythic associations. But what happened is that when the Latin alphabet replaces the runic system, you're now sort of displacing the mythic associations associated with their runic system too, with their alphabet. So now all of a sudden, I find it quite interesting that we don't have any myths saying how maybe Odin also brought a different alphabet, like the sort of like Roman alphabet or something like that. Because again, you have it in Greek, you have it in Roman, and then we have the runic origins with Odin. But that's kind of what I was trying to get at. Is just that the Romans brought the alphabet to the tribes devoid of any mythic connotations, and so the tribes already had their mythic system embedded with the runes. But since the Roman alphabet displaced the runes, you're now left with just a writing system which has no mythic connotation tied to it. Does that make sense?
That does. That does. It's interesting because like was that the kind of like if you would call it the beginning of the end, or where things, as you called it, everything became profane in the runic inscriptions and how it was
I
used.
think it had a large part to do with it, because because what happened is that the Roman alphabet was there to spread literacy, and so it displaced the runes. And the Roman alphabet, as we see later, was meant for everyone to use. We see all these, inscriptions, for example, with manuscripts that were actually written in Roman letters. And just literacy is becoming more prevalent, right? Especially throughout the Middle Ages. I mean, and it's just becoming more of a system that was meant for everyone to use. And whereas again, the runes were not in the beginning, the runes were not like that. They weren't meant for everyone to use. They were just meant for particular rune masters in the earliest times. So
All right. That all that is very interesting to hear
yeah.
about, and I have enjoyed. I mean, is there anything else you'd like to share on the worldview with runes?
When you use these runes, and I'm thinking about like the Bjorkatorp runic inscription right now, um, you have the mythic reference there about like bright shining runes and arguably hiding runes, and you don't talk about Roman characters that way, like usually, right? And even in the later manuscripts, you don't talk about like bright, um, shining letters, unless you're talking about the Bible. There are references to shining letters there, but you also don't talk about hiding Roman letters and inscriptions to maybe like hide a message or something like that. So, I mean, that's all I can really say. I guess you could say is just that yeah, the worldview does change, and the religion and the mythic aspects were definitely tied to the Elder Futhark. And since the Roman system came in and pretty much displaced that, it also threw away with a lot of the mythic connotations and mnemonic devices, with the rune poems and stuff like that. Although, of course, rune poems exist in the Roman language, thankfully. But yeah, slowly over time, it just displaced all of the runic symbols for the most
Yeah.
part.
All right. Then my last question is, do you have any messages for future generations?
Well, if you're trying to study runology, I guess if you're trying to study runology and you're interested in it as more of a practice, just study as much as you can objectively. Try to get at the good sources, the really good sources, not the sources like I mentioned in this video, which can be problematic. And just try to start there and then test things out. That's actually in Havamal, by the way. Do you know how to test them, like the runes? And sort of test them out and sort of see what your subjective experience is and see if it's for you or not. It's not supposed to, not it's not like a one size fits all. So if it's for you, then great. If it's not, maybe it's not. Maybe it's something else. But um, yeah, so just be rooted in things academically, be rooted in things objectively, and then test things out and see if it works for you.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Scott.